we have a somewhat different topic, although closely related in every way, to the questions of the 21st century. The major title is a new maritime strategy for the nation. It's based upon a global approach to the questions of the challenges and opportunities around the world. This is part of an analysis which has been going on for a period of time, which I know the Admiral will explain to you. This is a stage where, after much discussion around the nation and among the people in the maritime services, a strategy has been developed, and it will be articulated this evening, and we're delighted to join in the discussion of that. The four panelists this evening, I should say something about. The panel is chaired by Vice Admiral Morgan, John Morgan, who is the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for planning and information planning and strategy. He's held strategic planning type positions in the Navy. He's had a wonderful career. If you read his resume, he served on nearly all the Navy's vessels of one kind or another. He's been stationed in all the major theaters of the world. And an anecdote which isn't in his resume, which I just learned this evening, was that on 9/11, he was aboard in command of the Enterprise battle group returning to the United States, I believe. And of course, they too get CNN aboard these vessels, and saw what happened. And he immediately turned his battle group around and went back to the Persian Gulf area. And it was a command decision. No doubt it was the right one to make. And we always like it when someone does something on their own initiative, and the Admiral's one of those who does it. He has a marvelous reputation within the Navy. And that same battle group, the Enterprise, also participated in the first actions in Afghanistan. Our second speaker who will be joining us, General Nicholson, is also a Marine of deep experiences. When you look at all the units that he's dealt with on every level, it's impressive. He has commanded in Iraq, now later in his career as an operations officer for the 1st Marine Division, and as commander of the 5th Marine Regiment. And prior to those things, he's been a peace observer in the Balkans and in Palestine and elsewhere. A variety of experiences, as well as command positions on nearly all of the branches of the, or all of the levels of organization in the Army. Our other two speakers are Admiral Salerno of the Coast Guard. We're delighted to have with us. His positions now include inspection and supervision as director of that, and that includes worrying about coordinating between the services, as well as Homeland Security. And Commodore Williams is our guest from Canada. He's now the Assistant Chief of Maritime Forces in Canada. His last couple of assignments have been Director of Strategy and Strategic Planning and Director of Analysis. So those last two positions, analysis and strategy, clearly are related closely to our topic of this evening. The gentlemen are going to speak each for about 10 minutes, I understand. Admiral Morgan will we're delighted. We thought the Marines would arrive in a more dramatic fashion. And you've already been introduced, General. We're delighted to have you with us. With that, I turn the evening over to Admiral Morgan.
We're here to talk to you about and listen to you, I think, about a very important subject. I'm going to make the assertion that that the United States and close friends like Canada and the rest of the world, in fact, we're about to enter a new maritime era. All you have to do is look out the windows of this magnificent building and understand the importance that sea power has been to our country. In fact, if you were to read the Constitution tonight, you would see more reference to maritime commerce than any other subject in the Constitution. Sea power has been at the heart of this country since its inception. I think we're entering a new era, and that's why, along with the Marine Corps and the United States Coast Guard, and in close consultation with a number of friends around the world, we embarked last year on writing a new maritime strategy that would fit that era. But I'm most appreciative that the Council has allowed us to join you this evening. I thought what I'd do is just share a couple of insights with you via videotape. The first one, it's one of my favorites, but realizing that this is the Baltimore Council of Foreign Affairs, I thought we would start with just a touch of foreign affairs to get the dialogue going. And then I'd like to follow up with about another 5-minute video, and then we'll be happy to answer any of your questions. So let's start on the notion of foreign affairs. Go ahead, Isaac. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand there's gambling going on in here. I've always loved that clip, particularly when he gets the money at the end. But seriously, ladies and gentlemen, as we began to examine the importance of sea power to our future, we never attempted to try to predict what's going to happen 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or 20 years from now. But there was something working, we think, in the world that's very much linked to sea power, and that is the role of the global economy. Once again, all you have to do is look out these windows, and you can see that, and this is a pretty amazing statistics that I don't think many people realize, but 90%, 90% of the entire global commerce flows across the oceans. Can you imagine what would happen if 90% of the global commerce would be disrupted? In fact, 80% of the world's population now is living within 200 miles of a coastline, and in 20 years, we think it'll be within 50 miles of a coastline. And finally, 70% of this Earth is actually water. In fact, it's increasing. So when you see that kind of reality before you, and when you begin to examine what our American way of life is, and this is just not an American issue, is how do we sustain that? How do we sustain that economic prosperity, the global stability that's in all of our interests? That's why we began to examine the importance of sea power. And what I'd like to do is show one more video for you to show you the linkage we felt, and this was something that really stimulated our thinking, this is actually a PBS documentary called Commanding Heights. And it really begins to examine the emerging role of this stage of globalization. Globalization is not new, but we're perhaps in a different stage of it. And what we began to ask the question based upon these kinds of insights is, what is the linkage between American sea power and the global economy and the stability of the global community? So if we could, Isaac, show this video. It lasts about 5 minutes, and that's going to conclude my remarks. And I'll turn it over to the other panel members, and then I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Go ahead, Isaac.
The attack on America raised so many questions. Among them, questions about the dangers of the New World economy. Is terrorism the dark side of globalization?
Up until September 11th, there was a sense that this movement towards globalization really was irreversible. And since then, there's a recognition that things can go in another direction.
Can our deeply interconnected world deliver prosperity to everyone?
And that's basically the next big challenge, is making this interdependent world of ours, on balance, far more positive and negative. And the extent to which we succeed in doing that will determine whether the 21st century is either marred by terrorism of all kinds, or whether it becomes the most peaceful and prosperous and interesting time the world's ever known.
This is the story of how the new global economy was born. The story of a century-long battle of ideas to determine who would control the commanding heights of the economy, central governments or free markets. In the 1990s, a worldwide capitalist revolution fueled the new era of globalization, the greatest expansion of world trade in history.
Millions of people a day are better off than they would have been without globalization, and very few people have been harmed by it.
But with the promise came a debate about the impact of globalization.
Should the world's wealthiest people really dictate how the world's economy is going to run?
Tonight, the battle over who should write the new rules of the game for the global economy.
Could we possibly be entering a new period where there are new rules of the game? Certainly, we're seeing new players arrive on the scene. We're seeing new contributors to the global economy. Once again, we kept asking the question, what role will sea power play in that? Is sea power important to our future as it has been to our past? Should Americans like yourselves be concerned about what role we play with our seagoing forces, both the Coast Guard, the Marine Corps, and the United States Navy? We felt it was an important question to ask. And what we did is we began to embark upon a journey, if you will, that started with a program that we called A Conversation with a Country. And in the year it took us to create the new maritime strategy, we actually went around to 7 different cities across the country listening to Americans, asking them that question. What do you expect of your seagoing services? Is it important to your future? Is it important to the prosperity, security, and stability of this country? And from that, the program became so successful that we've continued it on this year. We published the new maritime strategy in October. We did it at the International Sea Power Symposium in Newport, Rhode Island, where, imagine this, we gathered the heads of 100 Coast Guards, Navies, and Marine Corps from around the world. The largest naval gathering in history, actually convened in Newport, Rhode Island back in October when we published the maritime strategy. This year, we've already been to Miami. We've been to Houston. Next week, we'll be in Denver. We're going on to Los Angeles in the middle of April, all to have this conversation with Americans about the importance of the future of sea power to our country. So I want to leave you with this thought, and that is, what role does sea power play in stabilizing and contributing to that global economy that you just saw depicted? You know, I think President Clinton really made a very key point in that video. We're probably on the verge of this century, realizing that the last century was the bloodiest century in the history of mankind. We're on the verge now of either turning to a very, very bright future that's very stable and prosperous, or perhaps a darker future. And it's our assertion in the United States Navy that American sea power can help us turn in the right direction. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my remarks. I would like to not take any questions now, but perhaps allow the other panelists to make their remarks, and then we'll all be able to field questions after they're through. So I really would like to turn now to Commodore Williams, our great friend from the North. I was with the head of the Canadian Navy most of the morning today, and it really shows you the level of international cooperation that we've had in trying to develop this new maritime strategy. Commodore?
Thank you very much, Admiral. I have prepared comments because we believe that this is so important. And so I'm going to start off by simply saying good evening, and thank you very, very much to the United States Navy for extending an invitation to Canada to participate in this dialogue. I feel greatly privileged to be here to share with you a Canadian perspective on your new cooperative strategy. In many ways, our two countries represent an ideal instance of the theme of partnership and cooperation that resonates throughout the focus of the discussion this evening. Indeed, it was just a couple of years ago when I was in command of HMCS Winnipeg in 2001 that I replaced USS Lake Champlain in the Constellation Battle Group and was deployed to the Persian Gulf under United States Operational Command. In fact, I was 300 miles east of Hawaii in Plain Guard Station on September 11th. Admiral Morgan turned around. We carried on home, and I returned back to the Gulf in a year. This evening, Charlottetown is forward deployed, assuring friends and deterring potential adversaries as a fully integrated member of the Harry S. Truman Battle Group. And together, they're working to suppress lawlessness at sea in all its forms and working to provide security to the maritime commons upon which the entire globalized economy depends. Meanwhile, here at home, our respective maritime services, together with a host of government agencies on both sides of the border, are working to secure the maritime approaches to our continent and building a common maritime picture that facilitates a whole-of-government response to our common security challenges. While there is much more that I could say in reviewing the work our two countries are already doing to defend our citizens and interests, I want to focus my comments this evening on the cooperative strategy itself. What follows then is not the view of my government, but rather my own appreciation gained from my years of service to a country that, to paraphrase John F. Kennedy, geography has made your neighbor and history has made your friend. It is evident from the headlines that the deepest problems of the international systems are weaving new patterns of crisis and conflict in an increasingly interdependent world. A whole new range of security challenges have begun to emerge in the opening decade of the 21st century that are all conspiring to create great uncertainty and volatility across the world. It is perhaps for this reason that the kind of foreign policy consensus that existed during the Cold War has yet to emerge. Indeed, there has been no equivalent that was written by George Kennan's famous long telegram in 1946, which not only alerted the world to the true nature of the Soviet regime, but more importantly, united us all around the idea of collective containment to deny the Soviet Union from achieving its malicious intent. I suspect that for all of us, a new focus for the post-Cold War era was crystallized on the cool, clear morning of September 11th, 2001, a moment that even the headlines in Paris proclaimed made us all Americans. I suspect for all of us, terrorism as manifested in the particularly hateful form of Al-Qaeda became a direct menace that required our immediate attention and vigorous response. However, I need to ask, is terrorism itself properly the object of our focus for the future, as it has seemed to be from the past? It is clear from my reading of the cooperative strategy that while its authors may blush at the comparison to Kennan's long telegram, my sense is that it has framed elegantly the coming policy debate by reminding us all of the enduring role maritime power has played, not just in securing our place in the world, but also our very way of life. Strong stuff indeed, but necessary if we're going to focus the discussion beyond the security challenges that now confront us in Iraq and Afghanistan to those that lie well beyond, to avoid the trap of believing that the world's dangers will always look the way they do now. It's my view that we're approaching a point of strategic inflection, a point driven, at least in part, by the heroic sacrifices being made by our two nations today in Iraq and Afghanistan, during which we will need to ask ourselves What direction do we need to go, not just to win the war on terror, but rather to secure the peace afterward? We need to debate in earnest what we stand for, what our collective will and our collective power is for, rather than what we're against. This is a debate in which Canada, as well as America's other close friends and allies, has a deep and abiding interest, one that ultimately will shape profoundly the Canadian forces that I serve. I suspect that few, if any, would dispute that globalization is among one of the most powerful forces reshaping our international system. While most will probably acknowledge that their nation's interests are best served by fostering a peaceful global system comprised of interdependent networks of finance, trade, information, law, people, and governance, the problem we seem to all be facing is that we're having trouble seeing the oceans for the trees. Many are forgetting, as the noted British defense academic Geoffrey Till said recently, sea power is at the heart of the globalization process in a way that land and air power are not. The cooperative strategy goes a long way in shaping the needed debate. What makes this document remarkable, in my view, is just how optimistic it is. I'm not talking about a misty-eyed kind of optimism, but rather a purposeful optimism of your nation that will remain unchallenged at sea for the decades to come. This brings a whole range of opportunities and a degree of geostrategic freedom that remains as powerful in shaping events in the first half of the century as it did in the latter half of the last. Clearly, you have remained mindful that as globalization reshapes the international system itself, the challenge it presents to a large fraction of the world's peoples will also be a principal driver in shaping all of our trajectories in the coming decades. While it's not possible to predict the choices other states will make in pursuing or protecting their perceived interests in the years ahead, we must all be prepared for a range of possible futures that are considerably bleaker than the one that the cooperative strategy aspires to promote. I would like to now narrow my comments and focus on the heart of the matter. In the past, our political masters have used maritime power primarily to assure, compel, or deter decision makers from captains at sea to captains of state. But while issues of the state, its claims, borders, and control of offshore resources will likely continue to shape discussion regarding the world's oceans in the coming decades, our traditional interpretation of engagement and diplomacy just may need to be broadened. Indeed, the cooperative strategy acknowledges this in elevating humanitarian assistance and disaster relief as core missions on par with strategic deterrence and sea control, suggesting that maritime forces operate not just in the oceanic commons to which Mahan referred, but rather the greater commons of the world's peoples. The implications of this thesis are both profound and pervasive, as they impact on maritime force structure decisions, as well as our future force employment options and postures. In many ways, we seem poised on the launch of a whole new national and international debate and dialogue to find a way to orchestrate the means to deliver and support those broader objectives. These are issues that are well beyond the reach of the world's navies, unless as part of a greater strategic effort. But there is much that the navies can do in helping to create the pillars of trust and understanding upon which the larger effort can stand. And there, in my view, lies the heart of the strategy. It offers new focus, a new rendezvous point of consensus that will allow sovereign states to come together and contribute to the extent that their means permit, returning us to what I referred to earlier as purposeful optimism. So in closing, ladies and gentlemen, Canada sees much in the cooperative strategy and believe that it resonates broadly with our enduring commitment to international peace and stability. to our tradition of active intervention in defense of the institutions, norms, and values that underscore the entire international system, our strong preference for collective and multilateral action, and our desire as a nation to play a larger role in the wider world commensurate with our gifts as a nation. What the cooperative strategy signals to both friends and potential adversaries are the choices that you would prefer making in leading the international community towards a more highly integrated and interdependent global system in which all nations and peoples of the world are enriched, rather than the much darker alternatives that may come to pass should globalization falter or fail. Thank you.
Kelly, thank you for coming to join us. It's a very important contribution that you've made. And ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you, in creating this new maritime strategy, it's the first time we've done that in the United States in the last quarter of a century. What was also historic about this document is that for the very first time, it has been signed by the head of the Navy, the head of the Marine Corps, and the head of the Coast Guard. And on that note, General, I'd like to turn it over to you for your remarks.
Sir, thank you. I hope everybody appreciates the dramatic last-minute entrance there, as is the cavalry-esque arrival here. I will tell you that I think my comments will sync up very closely with the Admiral's. And again, we are all very excited about the new maritime strategy, and as he said, the Commandant of both our Coast Guard and our Marine Corps have signed up to this, what I consider to be a historic document. And I'll tell you why I think this is so important is because here we are in the middle of still what our Commandant refers to as a long war. We still have 30,000 Marines in Iraq. I've spent 20 months in Iraq. I'm going back for 12 more in January, and I'm frankly very excited about that based on the progress that certainly we've seen in the Al-Anbar province. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that later. But I will tell you that for the Marine Corps, our Commandant is a little bit troubled because our expeditionary mindset and our sea service traditions are lapsed a little bit at this point. Based on almost a 1-in-1 rotation, which means an infantry battalion from Camp Lejeune or Pendleton will do 7 months in Iraq. They'll come back, and in 7 or 8 months later, they're on their way back. Many are on their 4th rotation, preparing for their 5th. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone in the battalion is on their 4th or 5th, because it's been 5 years now. But certainly, we have a core of very experienced young Marines and old Marines at this point, and that's a good thing to build upon. But our seagoing expeditionary nature with the United States Navy has lapsed a little bit. We're often asked, well, you know, what you're doing in Iraq is somewhat indistinguishable from what the Army is doing. And the answer is, well, you're probably right. So why are you doing it? Well, because our nation has asked us to do it, because we're good at it, and because if you look at our Al-Anbar province, we're very proud of the fact that the very first province that will probably be turned over in Iraq, okay, was the worst province 2 or 3 years ago, the deadliest province, and will be the first province in all of Iraq that is turned over completely to the control of the Iraqi government. And that is the only province, as you know, the largest province in Iraq and the only one that the Marine Corps is involved in. So I'm a little bit, I admit I have a soda straw view of the world, and I'm a little bit proud of what we've been able to accomplish here. But I didn't come here tonight to talk about Iraq. I came here to talk about the wonderful road ahead. Now, because our forces are in Iraq, sometimes it's very difficult to look a couple ridge lines beyond, but we are. I am now at Quantico, Virginia. Have been there since the summer. And we are very actively working with our Navy, Coast Guard, and international counterparts and interagency counterparts. And I want to hit that as well. We are looking 2 and 3 ridge lines away beyond Iraq, beyond Afghanistan, into a more maritime domain. If I ask anybody in the audience right now how many maritime amphibious operations have been conducted in the last 25 years, how many amphibious ops, and again, you know, the Marine Corps is in some ways a jack of all trades, a master of one, and that is amphibious operations. That's our core competency. That's why we exist. We are the soldiers from the sea, the warriors from the sea, and our linkage and our bond and our traditions with the United States Navy are timeless, and we will, and we are getting back to them. But if I ask you today how many amphibious ops, maritime ops have been done by the Navy Marine Corps team in the last 25 years, what kind of answers would I get? Does anybody dare to venture? 5? Oh, 5, okay. 12, 125. Wow. The answer is 101. We have 101 ops. Now, an op can be from tsunami relief response, where the Navy Marine Corps team responded significantly to a more kinetic, more traditional kinetic type amphibious operation, but 101. So 101 times over the last 25 years, our Navy Marine Corps team have responded to real-world contingencies, whether they're humanitarian relief contingencies or whether they were in defense of national objectives. And I think that's important, and that sometimes gets lost on what we're doing. I'm going to introduce a new concept tonight about the, at least relatively new. It's about sea-based forces, sometimes called sea basing, but we're going to talk about that. I've got a few quick slides, and I've been told I've got 10 minutes. I'm probably already 3 minutes into that, so we're going to push quickly. But there are a couple concepts I want to throw out that I think you'll find interesting and will probably stimulate some discussion. Next slide. There, you'll see a ring around what we call the arc of instability. Our intelligence agencies will tell us that there are 20 nations of great interest in the world today. Some of them are of interest because they are constantly being hammered by natural disasters. Sri Lanka is always of interest. Indonesia, the archipelagos, and the tremendous straits of Malacca. And of course, for all of our maritime trade, and it all ties together there, the economics of the world very much tied into there. But 20 out of those 20 nations, 18 are in our arc of instability. All right, next slide. Can we go next slide? Okay. Go back one. Okay. You know, Marine Corps loves acronyms, and one of the acronyms that's very popular in the joint world now is DIME. DIME is diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. It is the 4 elements of our national power. And I'll give you a great story from Fallujah about the informational piece. I remember sitting down. I would sit down every week with all the sheiks in Fallujah. And we had meetings every week with all the imams. We had 73 mosques in Fallujah. I could almost tell you who every imam was from every mosque. But every Tuesday we would get together, and it was very social, and we would sit and have meetings, and we would city council meetings, and we would talk about electricity, and we would talk about sewage, we could talk about good things and bad things that have occurred in the city over this last 7 days. And this has been going on for years. This is not something new, nor something I started, something I inherited. But it occurred to me, first of all, let me back up. Under Saddam's reign, there were no satellite dishes in Iraq at all. They were verboten. You couldn't have them. Today, every mud hut in Iraq has a satellite dish and is listening. And if you think about this story very quickly, I remember sitting there prior to city council meeting, and one of the senior leaders, one of the elders of the city came up. This is a city of 400,000, so this is a pretty good city. But he came up and he was very troubled. He'd just seen an episode of Desperate Housewives, and he was asking me about the episode. And of course, you know, it was amazing. But it brought home the fact, the globalization, the fact that here we are in the middle of Fallujah, and one of the senior leaders was really interested about the storyline. And does that really happen? And you know, so it was a great story for me, but fascinating. But certainly underscored the fact of the shrinking world we have. Tom Friedman would, in fact, I should send a story to him. He'd be very proud of that story. Joint interagency. In Iraq and today throughout the world, when we go to war, when we go anywhere, we don't go alone. And we've always gone with the Navy, and we always have a great relationship there. But today, more than ever, we go with State Department. We go with Commerce. We go with USAID. We go with intelligence agencies. There are more and more opportunities for deployment and for real-world work as a combined joint and interagency team. And I think that certainly is a wave of the future. And as we look past Iraq and as we look at some of the forward presence, you know, they say in real estate the 3 most important things are location, location, location. Well, for us as a Marine Corps, it's our three buzzwords are forward deployed, expeditionary, forward deployed, expeditionary, forward deployed, and expeditionary. We take our own airfields and ports with us, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about sea basing. We don't have to depend on other countries necessarily to give us access, denied access. How much money did we offer Turkey, the country of Turkey, to allow the 4th Infantry Division to go through Turkey? And Turkey is a great ally, has been one of our stalwarts in the Cold War. Turkey's been one of the greatest allies we've had, and they live in a tough neighborhood. And we've been very supportive with them, trying to get in the EU, et cetera. But when it came down to it, we couldn't get them in. The 4th ID couldn't come in, and we couldn't come into Iraq from the north and have a pincer movement from several directions. Okay, so boy, that kind of underscores the fact that even sometimes our best friends don't necessarily want that large footprint ashore. So if the Navy Marine Corps team can prepare forward deployed forces off the coast in a sea base type environment, where again we take our own port and airfield with us, that's something we're very interested in. And forward deployed is obviously where we want to be. Okay, next slide. Okay, why sea basing or why forward deployed? And again, I will tell you today in the Gulf of Guinea, the United States Navy is working some concepts. They've got some amphibs. They have all manner of ships there, to include forward deployed multi-mission ships. And Admiral, I know that you're well familiar with the operation going in the Gulf of Guinea, but it's a model, and we're very interested in that. We're watching what's going on there. It's a nodal point for both interagency, for joint, and well beyond Navy Marine Corps operations. Why sea basing? Again, we talked about the Turkey example. Next slide. I want to show you the continuum of what we would consider to be the level of responses, all the way from green, which would be environmental responses, going through NEO. The last big NEO we did. A NEO is a non-combatant evacuation operation. When the Hezbollah Israeli unpleasantries were going on strong, not too many months ago, we had a U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine Corps non-combatant evacuation that went into Beirut and pulled out all of American and many third country national citizens. It's one of our core competencies is to be able to do a non-combatant evacuation, and the Navy and Marine Corps practices that very good. And they come in two flavors: permissive, where the host country will let you come in and do that, and non-permissive, where you've got to kind of fight your way in, find your American citizens, find your diplomats, find your families, and their pets oftentimes, okay, and then possibly have to fight your way back out. And that's, again, something we spend a lot of time talking about. If you'll look at this slide, really what we look at is kind of a rheostat in terms of the capabilities we bring, in terms of the type of environment. We can have certainly a more kinetic face force, or it can be a more humanitarian type force. So we can rheostat up and down the size and the nature of what we're involved in. Next slide, persistent engagement. We're almost finished here. I think as we look, the most important thing I will leave you with is, as we look beyond Iraq, what we're looking at is a buzz term now in the Marine Corps and probably throughout DOD, is phase zero operations. Phase zero operations is, okay, why wait until something bad is happening in country X? Why don't we go to country X earlier? Work with the local military. Start empowering, start trying to find out more about that country. Today we're doing something exciting with our young lieutenants, our young officers at the basic school. Every officer that is graduating from the basic school now is being assigned a region and a language. And I think we all understand institutions get what they reward. So if that young officer thinks he's going to be promoted to the grade of captain and major, lieutenant colonel and beyond, he's going to have to show a competency in that language. Just the same way, we have to do X amount of pull-ups and run times, and we're obsessed with our statistics, about how fast we can run, how many pull-ups we can do, how many sit-ups we can do, or crunches we can do. Well, we're going to be obsessed with his ability as well to speak a foreign language, because we all realize that if we're serious about what we call theater security cooperation and forward presence, working with embassies and country teams throughout the world, if we're really serious about that, and we pick and choose our countries that we work with, then we better have some core competencies in language skills. You can't be dependent upon interpreters and hiring contractors to do that. You better have young officers and enlisted, but especially those young officers, you'd better get them trained in the culture of a region and in the language. And again, you may not have to, well, French is a great example. You learn French, you become good in French, and you can do very well on the continent of Africa. And again, the old joke is if you want to fly from one country in Africa to another, you're going to change planes in Paris. And that is probably still very true. The surge is a big topic, but you can't surge trust and cooperation. You can't. You can't surge that. It's either there or it's not. So when you're talking about some of these countries that are probably struggling a little bit, could use a little bit of attention, I think having those relationships built there is very important. I'll tell you a troubling stat. We used to bring a lot of officers, and Admiral Stratovitis from Southcom told us this during my capstone visit down there. There are more officers now, Latin American officers, going to staff colleges and schools in Beijing than there are in the United States now. And why is that? Why does it happen? Well, nature doesn't like a vacuum. And as our attention shifted from maybe Latin America a little bit to the Middle East, we've not maybe spent as much time and attention there. And we want to get back to that. And that's why you see this map. You'll see that we have Marine forces working with embassies. And it might be a platoon. It might be a platoon in Uruguay. It might be a platoon. But theater engagement, okay, working for that combatant commander wherever he thinks there is a need, whether it's AFRICOM, the newly emerged AFRICOM, or Southcom, but having our forces, having Marines who are regional experts, who speak the language, go in there and work with these countries, work with those militaries. Don't wait for something bad to happen. Get in there a little bit ahead of time, and that's important. I joke a lot that in Iraq, and I used to tell my young officers, you got to be prepared to eat a lot of goat, and you got to be prepared to get kissed by a lot of sheiks. And they're very friendly and very kissy. I tell that story, and it came back at me one day. I told that story, and after the brief, the guy comes up and goes, "Hey, Brigadier General, I really enjoyed your story. I understand why you eat goat, but why are you kissing so many sheep?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to have to articulate that story a little more clearly from now on." So, no sheep kissing, but a lot of sheep kissing. All right, next slide. And this is our last slide. This really just kind of shows the four levels of a MAGTF. A MAGTF is one of those Marine words. Again, we love our acronyms. Marine Air Ground Task Force. What makes us different than the Army? Well, wherever we go, we are a force that we don't need a lot of help. We bring our own airplanes, and we have our own, fixed wing. We have our own rotary wing. We have our own logistical support. We are a Marine Air Ground Task Force, and we deploy as a contained, self-contained unit. And those are the four levels that you see there, all the way from a SC MAGTF, which could be 100 guys, up to a MEF, which could be about 40,000 guys. So that's how we deploy it. That is, again, one of our core competencies is we are warriors from the sea, number one, and number two, we deploy as a self-contained unit. Last slide. And again, tying right into what the Admiral said again, the cooperative strategy for the 21st century. We're very proud to be a signatory to this document. I think it defines where we want to go. And again, I just need to know, I would just reinforce, although I think we're doing great things in Iraq today, and I think we've certainly come a long way since my first tour in Iraq, we are looking beyond Iraq because obviously no matter what happens, I think our role in Iraq will start to diminish as we start looking beyond it. So with that, I will close, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Our last panelist this evening is from the Coast Guard, and I'll remind you that the Coast Guard now resides in the Department of Homeland Security. They're not a member, they're not a part of the Department of Defense, but it is that interagency cooperation that we're also fostering, and so we were delighted when the Coast Guard Commandant, Admiral Thad Allen, elected to join the Navy and the Marine Corps in signing the new maritime strategy. So, Brian, to you, sir.
Thanks, Admiral, and good evening to all of you. I'm particularly happy to be here. It's fun for me to come back to Baltimore. I'd spent an earlier tour in my career in the Coast Guard right here, so it's a little bit like coming home. But thank you all for inviting me to participate this evening, and thank you, Admiral Morgan, for including me on the panel. I think that having a discussion like this is particularly appropriate in a seaport. Baltimore, like many seaports, is an engine of our economic activity. It connects our nation, our economy, to the rest of the world. But particularly right here in Baltimore, you know, we're reminded of our maritime heritage. I mean, right outside the window is the U.S. frigate Constellation, which is just a tremendous symbol of our naval and Marine Corps heritage. And another one, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Taney, a museum ship. Do you know that Taney is the only existing remaining vessel that was present at the attacks on December 7th, 1941 in Pearl Harbor? So these two symbols, I think, indicate tell us a lot about our maritime heritage. They also tell us, you know, our services have worked together in the past. But what is really significant about the discussion we're having tonight is that this really is the first time that the three sea services have collectively sat down and figured out how to jointly apply our nation's sea power to our national needs. It's an historic document. And we in the Coast Guard are very proud to be part of this team, and we applaud the leadership of then Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Mullen for conceiving the idea, and Admiral Roughead, the current CNO, for carrying it through to fruition. You know, as Admiral Morgan mentioned, the oceans do connect all the nations of the world. You know, we are in a global economy, and the freedom of movement on the world's oceans matter to nations even if they don't have a seacoast. The volume of trade, that 90% of international movement, affects them too. In fact, that volume of trade is growing. You know, the percentage stays the same, but you know, the economists are predicting that the actual volume, the tonnage of cargo that moves between countries, is actually going to double in the first 2 decades of this century. And we're seeing that in the statistics that the government collects. Cargo is, in fact, going up. So we're a nation that's very dependent on that movement of cargo, and so we have an interest in maintaining that free flow. So what does the Coast Guard have to do with all of that? And what value do we provide to this maritime strategy? Why were we included in it in the first place? Well, if you're like most people, you probably have a certain idea of what the Coast Guard is and what it does. You know, you may view us as a search and rescue organization. We save a lot of lives. We're very proud of that. It's part of who we are. We're also you may view us as a law enforcement organization or as a first responder. You know, you saw all those pictures of Katrina or maybe 9/11. Or here in a commercial port, you may see us as regulators of commercial maritime activity. And if you see us in any one of those guises, you're right, we do all of that. That's part of what we do. But what's not well understood about the Coast Guard is that we're also a military service, full-time, active duty military service all the time. We're the 5th Armed Service. Now, we are a little bit different. We're not housed in DOD. We are in DHS, as Admiral Morgan mentioned. And we're kind of small compared to the other services. You know, we're often compared to the New York City Police Department in terms of size. So we're not that big, you know. But we do have some capabilities that are unique. And one of them is the fact that even though we're full-time military service, we're also a law enforcement agency. That's unique. The normal restrictions, the posse comitatus restrictions against the use of military forces and domestic law enforcement do not apply to the Coast Guard. We can do both, which is kind of an interesting capability and a very useful capability. And what it means is we kind of view ourselves as being a little bit bilingual, you know, because we can speak the language of DOD. Our forces are meant to be interoperable with DOD. We also speak the language of the civilian interagency, and that really becomes very useful when you have large-scale domestic events like a natural disaster, a hurricane or an earthquake, or a 9/11, where you actually need a bridge between DOD forces that may be called in to support civil authorities and the local first responders. Another common perception, or maybe even misperception, about the Coast Guard is that we operate almost exclusively in the United States. Now, the truth is most of our forces are based in the United States, but we are, in fact, very heavily engaged internationally. There are regional and bilateral agreements we have with navies and coast guards all around the world. I'll give you a couple of examples. There's something called the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum that we engage in, and it's an opportunity for us to bring in countries like China, Japan, Russia, Korea. Friends in Canada also participate, and we jointly coordinate on areas of mutual interest. Just recently, a Coast Guard cutter operating in the Western Pacific on a fisheries, high seas fisheries patrol had a Chinese law enforcement officer on board enforcing international regulations on high seas drift nets. We actually captured or found a couple of Chinese vessels that were violating international requirements, and we're able to turn them over to Chinese authorities for prosecution. And what that does is show that, you know, there are occasions, this is a small example, but there are occasions where our interests coincide with those of other nations, and we can cooperate jointly and reaffirm that idea that there are mutual interests and there is a system of governance on the high seas, which for many, many years has been considered ungovernable. So we're actually trying to establish that sense of governance. The North Pacific Forum is so successful, we're doing the same thing in the Atlantic with mostly European countries. A lot of other international activity as well. You know, the Coast Guard leads the international delegation to the International Maritime Organization. All the maritime countries of the world come together, and that's where we can influence and shape standards that apply to maritime safety, maritime security, and even environmental protection. We've been doing that for years. Admiral Morgan mentioned 90% of our trade comes by sea. If you look at where it comes from, you can identify about 160 different countries. And within those countries, many ports that export goods, materials to the United States. One of our concerns, one of our interests is helping them help themselves in terms of maintaining proper security measures in those ports. So how do we do that? We actually go out and visit all these countries and see what they're doing to improve their security. That improves the security of the international supply chain. It helps build capacity, and it also, quite honestly, makes us more aware of what to expect on ships coming from those ports. Numerous bilateral agreements for counter-drug, counter-migrant, and also for the interception of potentially dangerous materials on the high seas, including weapons of mass destruction or precursor materials for WMD. A lot of international activity, and I could go on. And since I have a Canadian colleague here, this is an interesting aside. During Hurricane Katrina, the Coast Guard sent most of its helicopters from around the country down to the affected area, and they were doing things that you all saw on TV, pulling people off of rooftops and so forth. Some of our stations were pretty much cleared out. Air Station Cape Cod in Massachusetts had no Coast Guard helicopters left. They were all down on the Gulf Coast. Guess who stood our search and rescue guard during that time when the Coast Guard helicopters were away? Our friends the Canadians did. They operated out of Cape Cod Air Station, which is really quite remarkable that another country, we have such a close relationship with this country that they could plug in and interoperate with us. Our doctrine is similar enough that they could do that. It's really remarkable. And there are other examples I could give you later. So, you know, in this new construct that we're talking about, this globalized construct where the services work together, you almost can't even think of this old breakdown of a home game and an away game, you know, where all the DoD forces are overseas and the Coast Guard forces and domestic forces are here. We really need to interoperate. It is a global economy. The threats are global in nature. So what we need to do is apply all the capabilities in our toolkit wherever they're needed. So Coast Guard cutters, Coast Guard forces may need to operate as part of a joint task force thousands of miles from home. In the same way that naval forces may need to operate at times domestically, you know, in support of civil authorities or in the event of a major incident. You may not be aware of this, but it's also worth mentioning. Do you know that there are many naval vessels, U.S. naval vessels, that operate in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific that actually have Coast Guard law enforcement teams on board? And they're there. It's a cooperative effort used in the counter-drug effort. And they're very successful. This is just a good opportunity or a good example of how the services can work together in furtherance of national interests. So we have Coast Guard capabilities that can be used around the world. We have some unique capabilities. How have they been used? Just a couple of examples of how we support DoD combatant commanders around the world. Since 9/11, there was a requirement at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for perimeter security. And DoD has approached the Coast Guard looking for some specialized capabilities that were in our inventory. We have these things called port security units that are deployable. And were called up. And since shortly after 9/11, they have been there more or less continuously, providing that type of security under the operational control of the DoD commander. In the Persian Gulf, 6 Coast Guard patrol boats have been there for several years now, maintaining security of the offshore oil platforms off the Iraqi port of Qasr. They work with the Navy and with the Marine Corps in securing these oil platforms, very critical to the economy of Iraq. They're also used to help train Iraqi maritime forces, again, working with Navy and Marine forces in doing that. So just 2 examples of how that's currently playing out. Looking ahead, we see a role for Coast Guard forces in Africa, working with a Navy-led Africa Partnership Station, and potentially as well with the Joint Sea Basing. Recently, we commissioned a new command within the Coast Guard. It's called the Deployable Operations Group, which is our force manager for 34 specialized units within the Coast Guard. These units can operate independently, or they can operate as part of a joint task force or with other DoD or civilian agencies. They bring some capabilities that include port security, as I mentioned, but also counterterrorism, hazardous material response, and tactical law enforcement. So these are tools that are meant to be interoperable. Meanwhile, we're also the sole provider of icebreakers for the nation. We maintain the only ships in the U.S. inventory that can maintain a sustained surface presence in the Arctic. And as there's now water where there ice used to be in many locations, and there's more human activity taking place up there, including energy exploration, ecotourism, fishing, and so forth, our national interests are being redefined, and so that remains a challenge for us. So what do we see are challenges in the future? Really 3, and I'll sum up in about 30 seconds here. One is interoperability. As the Coast Guard acquires new platforms and capabilities, we need to make sure that whatever we buy is consistent with what the Navy's buying. If our ships can't talk to each other, if our sensors don't link to each other, we will not be as effective as the country expects and as this new strategy demands. The other thing is maritime domain awareness, and I believe the General mentioned that. This is making ourselves aware of the full range of maritime activity. It's not just tracking ships, it's knowing what their intentions are and understanding trade patterns and relationships and how people and cargo move, and then looking for the anomalies. This is being jointly led by DHS and the Director of National Intelligence, but absolutely it's imperative that we have the support and continuing cooperation of the Navy. They bring enormous capability to that challenge. And finally, it's just training our people. We're asking them to operate in a far more complex world than I started out in. So training them to be interoperable, to understand the interagency, to work